May it please your lordship. Members of the jury. My client allowed Mrs. Savage to occupy the penthouse in the expectation of their marriage. That marriage has not taken place. And after seeing the parties concerned, you may well feel that of all the marriages contemplated between man and woman, this was the one least likely ever to be solemnized. By what right, therefore, does Mrs. Savage continue to occupy the flat at Green Park House? You've heard that she sold her house in Chapel Street, and you may be sure that through the good offices of Mr. Lieberman she has obtained the top market price. Does she then want both to pocket the money for that and retain my client's flat? We turn now to the part played by Mr. Mark Lieberman in this affair. You may well feel that the involvement between this young man and Mrs. Savage has been peculiarly close throughout. She was on his arm when my client first met her. She was again his companion on her visit to the south of France. And when Mr. Lieberman returned unexpectedly 2 months later from America, who should he see emerging naked from his fiancée's private suite but the prodigal son again? Who could blame him if he was shocked into abandoning his marriage plans? My learned friend has suggested that my client's real reason for wanting to eject Mrs. Savage from the penthouse was that he wanted to gain control of the whole of Green Park House in order to dispose of the lease to some company or corporation. I hope, members of the jury, you will treat this suggestion with the contempt it deserves, since, as you yourselves have heard, no suitable client for Green Park House was found until long after the unfortunate episode on the 27th of May took place. In conclusion, after what has been said about him in court, I must remind you that my client has treated Mrs. Savage throughout with the utmost generosity. He's allowed her to keep all the presents he lavished on her to the value of some £14,000. All he asks of this court is that she should be made to relinquish the penthouse, to which she has no right, either in morality or law.
Please, your lordship. Members of the jury. From time to time, a case comes up for hearing in these courts in which the cost, in terms of suffering and humiliation to both parties, seems to far outweigh any advantage that may be gained by either of them. Now, this you may think is such a case. We don't know what Mr. Lieberman's motives were in bringing this action against Mrs. Savage. He may have wished to punish her for what he believed to be her infidelity. Or rather, more simply, he may have wanted to regain possession of an extremely valuable piece of property which in happier times he had bestowed on her. The third possibility, which you'll remember I put to Mr. Lieberman, is that the public outcry over these vast empty office blocks that disfigure London caused him some concern. And he was anxious to find a tenant for the building, which of course he couldn't do so long as Mrs. Savage was in occupation of a part of it. But whatever his reasons for bringing this action, members of the jury, he's paid a high price. He has publicly accused his son of indulging in sexual intrigue with the woman whom he, Mr. Lieberman Sr., was about to marry. Now, that you may think is about as squalid an accusation as a man can make against his own flesh and blood, and one which I submit is totally unsupported by the evidence. Now, what is this evidence? It has been established that Mr. Lieberman is an astute and successful, very successful businessman. Here is a man whose business activities demand the services of a permanent private detective. Now, I submit that if evidence had existed, my learned friend would have done more than just imply a sexual relationship. And we've heard from Mark Lieberman, a young man whose way of life is admittedly unconventional. We've heard how he was locked out of his flat in the middle of the night. Now, what more natural than that he should telephone Mrs. Savage and ask for her assistance? What more natural than that she should give it? This was no guilty pair of lovers. Their relationship was simply that of a young man to the woman who was about to become his stepmother, a relationship devoid of any sexual overtones. Apart from the question of dress, There are no great discrepancies in the accounts given by both parties of what Mr. Lieberman saw on the morning he arrived unexpectedly at his fiancée's flat. The difference is in the interpretation which Mr. Lieberman chose to put upon it. And we shall never know whether he was blinded to all reason by his unjustified suspicions, or whether he more calculatingly set about using these suspicions as a means of regaining the penthouse. We cannot tell how in that businessman's mind of his the loss of future wife would weigh against the acquisition of £200,000, perhaps much more. But what is certain, members of the jury, is that the decision to break off the engagement was Mr. Lieberman's. Mr. Lieberman's alone. Now I ask you not to make Mrs. Savage a victim of a maneuver which may have its origins not in jealousy, members of the jury, but in simple commercial greed.
Members of the jury, it is now my task to direct you as briefly and clearly as I can to the requirements of the law, so that you may come to a fair and just decision. You may have been puzzled, as I was, by the fact that no written contract was drawn up between the parties. But I must direct you that in law the position is this. The defendant has no right to sell or otherwise dispose of the property. Her entitlement to the enjoyment of this penthouse is limited to the right to occupy it for her own personal use. But the question before you is, for how long? If you believe the defendant when she tells you that Mr. Lieberman urged her to move in immediately without any conditions as to marriage, she is entitled to remain in possession of the property for as long as she wishes. If, I repeat, the gift was unconditional. The plaintiff, on the other hand, has told you that he gave Mrs. Savage the use of the flat only until such time as a proper marriage settlement could be drawn up, which you may think will now never happen, the engagement having been broken off. If you accept the plaintiff's evidence, therefore, I shall have to bring in an order for possession against Mrs. Salvage. But, members of the jury, there is a third possibility. If you find that the gift was conditional on marriage, but that the defendant nevertheless wrongfully and without just cause refused to marry the defendant on a mistaken view of her infidelity, she would be entitled to remain in possession. Now, members of the jury, you are the sole judges of fact, and I put to you 3 questions. 1. Was the handing over of the flat by means of the gift of the key unconditional and independent of their remaining engaged? Or 2, was it done simply and solely on condition that the marriage took place later? 3, if so, has the plaintiff wrongfully refused to honor that condition by breaking off his engagement to the defendant without just cause, and in such a way that the defendant, by the sale of her house, has acted irrevocably to her detriment? Members of the jury, you will now retire and consider your verdict.
The jury, made up of members of the public, are now returning to the courtroom to deliver their findings in the case of Lieberman versus Salvage. No one in court knows whether they will find for the plaintiff, Mr. Emmanuel Lieberman, or for the defendant, Mrs. Delia Salvage.
Rise, please. Members of the jury,
Are you all agreed upon your verdict?
We are.
You find for the plaintiff or for the defendant?
For the defendant.
Very well. I shall enter judgment for the defendant.
My lord, will you make an order as to costs?
Yes. I award costs to the defendant.
Rise, please.
Next week, a chance for you to join another jury in assessing the facts when our cameras again return to watch a leading case in the Crown Court.